job as acting president to introduce you, Genevieve. I'm delighted that you are coming virtually, 9 hours time difference, I believe, indeed. So while it's morning for her, it's early evening for us. And as you start your day, I hope you enjoy starting your day at the Hertie School. I'd like to welcome all participants here to tonight's event. It's entitled Forced Labor and Labor Law That Excludes. It is part of the event series, Understanding the Policies, the Politics and Policies of Exclusion that the Hertie School has been hosting. In fact, I think this is now the third semester that we are doing this. Before I hand this over to Sebastian Mena, he's professor of organization and governance here at the Hertie School, I would like to share a few more details on the event series itself. This is meant to set the scene for an important study for the school, which is planned for completion at the end of next year. And specifically, we're related because it's all about what Hertie itself did. For those of you who are unfamiliar with our history, the Hertie School bears the household name, which belonged to a successful chain of department stores, which prior to its unionization under the Nazi regime, were owned by the Jewish family Tietz. After they were forced to sell the company assets, members of the Tietz family immigrated to the United States. Georg Kog was appointed as the new managing director and later became the subsequent owner of the Hertie brand. In November 2020, the Hertie Foundation commissioned the Gesellschaft für Unternehmungsgeschichte to conduct a comprehensive study on the history of its assets. This independent study is being conducted as we speak. Two historians, Johannes Baer and Dr. Ingo Köhler, are working on this. They start in 1933, but they also look at the post-war period. Now, the idea of this series is we've got this academic book that's being written about the Hertie history, and we want to think about different themes that come from this. So Genevieve, we've had some talks. Usually the first talk in a given semester is more historical. So what actually happened in 33? What's the context in which other firms were Aryanized? Then we usually have a more contemporary talk. For example, Daniel Ziblatt came and talked about the decline of democracy. In your case, we're going to think a bit more about this, I think also some contemporary issues, but some issues that also go back in terms of some of the history that is there. And I think it'd be very nice to kind of complement things that we have here. I should say, I have here my notes claim that you are professor of politics at the University of Sheffield and PI of ReStructure Lab, but I know that you are on your way to Simon Fraser in Canada. And I'm delighted that you have the opportunity indeed to head a policy school, that we can think kind of policy school to policy school in some ways. She will speak about the issue of forced labor and the promise and limits of government efforts to eradicate it from supply chains. I won't take any more time at this point, but I would like to pass the floor over to Sebastian Mena, who will introduce Professor LeBaron. Is it LeBaron or LeBaron? I'm sorry, Sebastian has French, so it's tricking me a bit. But I just want to say he'll go further into some of the details. But I'm delighted to have you here. I want to welcome everybody who's here online on this Zoom. And Sebastian, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mark. And thank you as well for making sure that this important study is being undertaken, and also for organizing this series, bridging the past with the present, which is actually very dear to me as well. So I'm Sebastian Mena. I'm a professor of organization and governance at the Hertie School. As Mark said, I will guide you through this evening. Welcome, everyone. Thanks a lot for joining us. It's my real pleasure to welcome Genevieve LeBaron, which I think is the way we pronounce it, to speak with us tonight. She has an amazing CV and career. She's indeed currently professor of politics at the University of Sheffield, where she was also director of the Political Economy Research Institute from 2018 to 2020. But she's moving as of January 2022 as the director of the School of Public Policy at Simon Fraser University. Congratulations on the new position. As Mark mentioned, she's also principal investigator of the ReStructure Lab, which is a very interesting structure and very easy to find online as well, restructurelab.org. Developing briefs, policy briefs with very actionable recommendations in order to think about how we can rebuild supply chains after the pandemic to promote equitable labor standards, worker rights, and abolish forced labor. So Beyond her professorial position, Genevieve also serves on the UK Parliament's Modern Slavery and the Supply Chain Advisory Group at the UK government, and she serves in the reference group for the United Nations Delta 8.7 as well. She's also elected to the College of the Royal Society of Canada in 2020, and this speaks, I think, to the value of her advisory work in general. She's held many visiting positions throughout the world in very renowned universities. I won't go through the list. And I just want to highlight that research focuses on the business and governance of forced labor, modern slavery, and human trafficking in global supply chains. More broadly on issues of inequality, power, and labor in the international political economy. She's published numerous journal articles, which I won't go through as well, but I just want to highlight a few important books that she wrote, mostly on forced labor, which is the topic of today, and slavery. In particular, the book published in 2020, Combating Modern Slavery, Why Labor Governance is Failing and What We Can Do About It, published by Polity Press. And it's a very telling account of the ubiquitousness of modern slavery in global supply chains, and very critical work as well of these global supply chains. And while our work is critical in general, as it should, I think it also very much points to solutions, which I think we will hear about more today. In our various aspects of our work, both as a researcher, but also as a policy advisor, and perhaps as a teacher as well, I guess. And I will give you the floor right away. The structure of this session tonight will be 30 minutes of the keynote speech by Genevieve, and then we'll have the remaining time, which is about 15 to 20 minutes. We'll see how much we exactly have for a discussion with her. I'm happy to take questions from the chats or directly from your microphones. But for now, the floor is yours, Genevieve. Thanks again for accepting our invitation.
Okay. Thank you so much, Mark and Sebastian, for hosting me and for this wonderful welcome. It's really such a tremendous honor for me to be able to speak at the Hertie School, a school that I've followed for a long time, and admire the work that you're doing there. I really commend the work you're doing with this study around the finances and history. I think that's very important. And also this series around exclusion that you mentioned, it strikes me as amazingly necessary and a wonderful initiative. So I'm honored to be here today with you, and thank you all for coming and hosting and organizing it so beautifully, and also look forward to cooperation between Hertie School and the new public policy school that I'll be working at going forward. So my talk today will draw from two recent empirical studies that I've conducted on forced labor. And I want to just take a moment to acknowledge at the outset that these have been collaborative projects, as has the policy brief work that I'll be discussing as well through the ReStructure lab. I've done these two big empirical studies supported by postdoctoral research fellows, research assistants in the United Kingdom, United States, India, Ghana, Honduras, Ethiopia, and Myanmar. As well, I'll draw on a couple of policy briefs that I've written in collaboration with colleagues at Yale and Stanford through the ReStructure lab, as Sebastien mentioned. So I just want to acknowledge, this is really collaborative work, and I want to thank my colleagues for their contributions to the work that I'll share with you today. I thought it would be helpful to begin by clarifying the term forced labor, just so we're all on the same page about what we're talking about here. And then I'm going to go into a discussion of what forced labor looks like today, why it's so challenging for policymakers to combat it, and what some of the promise and limits of various initiatives are that are out there right now, trying to deal with the phenomena of forced labor in supply chains. Forced labor is thrown around. It often means many different things to many different people. You may have heard the term modern slavery, which is a sort of catch-all term that's used to describe contemporary forms of exploitation, often, used by different people to mean different things. And so it's a term that I avoid in my work because it's a bit nebulous and slippery and doesn't have a clear definition in international law. Forced labor, by contrast, does have a grounded definition in international law, specifically the International Labor Organization's 1930 Forced Labor Convention, which defines forced labor as all work or service which is exacted from any person under the threat of a penalty, and for which the person has not offered himself or herself voluntarily. So basically, to qualify as forced labor, a situation needs to have two key components. It needs to be involuntary, and it needs to be happening under the threat of penalty, which we can understand essentially as coercion. So the worker needs to be working involuntarily and prevented from leaving or stuck in the situation because they're facing, for instance, physical or psychological coercion. And for over 200 years, economic thinkers have predicted forced labor will be swept away as capitalism and globalization circle around the globe, as market relations come to dominate, and employers, it's often been theorized, would favor free workers because they have tended to be thought of as more efficient than enslaved workers. And these, debates around the compatibility of forced labor and capitalism go back to classical political economic thinkers like Adam Smith, who were grappling with some of the issues in their day and continue up to the present. I won't go deep into that now, but I'm certainly happy to talk about some of these theories in the discussion. For now, suffice it to say that, whatever economic theorists might have predicted, the reality is that forced labor today appears to be accelerating, not diminishing in supply chains. It's common in many goods, many countries and many sectors. It's associated with goods and services, both for domestic consumption as well as for export abroad, including to Europe and to North America. I'll name just a few of the sectors that are known to be reliant on forced labor. Things you'll probably know from media headlines: electronics, apparel, footwear, PPE equipment, flowers, pretty much every food product that you can think of, from cocoa to coffee to bananas to rice to seafood. I think it's fair to say that it's much, much harder to name a product that hasn't been made with forced labor than it is to name one that has. And indeed, slavery and forced labor have existed for a long time. So these are not new problems in many senses. But I think what is new here is that globalization and the transnational nature of contemporary supply chains and the way that those are regulated and the governance architecture that sits around them is exacerbating the challenge of eradicating forced labor. So as many of you will know, supply chains often cut across multiple jurisdictions. They often have low degrees of protection for workers, and large companies often source from thousands and thousands of suppliers. So for instance, Walmart has over 100,000 direct suppliers, and each of those suppliers has several tiers of suppliers below them. And so governing the labor standards in these chains is an enormous challenge. If we think of the making of a single good, like a laptop computer, for instance, the workforce that is responsible for making that is splintered over many different jurisdictions and national economies. And this is part of the challenge of dealing with this problem of forced labor. So although today forced labor, if we look at domestic law, is illegal in most countries, and it has been in many countries for a couple hundred years, it does remain widely used. And we see that in several jurisdictions, businesses are able to enact forced labor with virtual impunity. It's very rare that businesses are made to face consequences for these practices. When we think of media reports on forced labor, we often get the sense that forced labor is something that happens from criminals sort of sneaking around in the darkness, tricking and trapping people. But the reality is that forced labor very rarely happens in these sorts of ways. It's not often a kind of dramatic or sensationalist moment when a worker finds themselves in that situation. More often, it occurs in mostly legal businesses that happen to use a few illegal practices. And so workers become victims of forced labor, in quiet moments when they sign a contract in a language they don't understand, they sign a loan agreement that has usurious interest rates, they hand over a passport to their employer, that sort of thing. So I want to share just a few examples of forced labor from my recent research, which I think underscore what I'm saying here, which is that forced labor is really a predictable and stable feature of supply chains and the commercial dynamics that are associated with those. And this has become even more true in some sectors during the COVID-19 pandemic, as I'll explain. So the first example comes from a study that I conducted a few years ago, 2016 to 2019, and it was called the Global Business of Forced Labor Project. It was funded by the UK Economic and Social Research Council, and the project has sought to explore how and why forced labor emerges within supply chains, as well as which types of businesses tend to use forced labor. Why do they have a demand for forced labor? How do they profit from it? And how successful are public and private initiatives to combat forced labor, with a focus on the cocoa and tea industries. So I've elaborated here on the slide because there's no rigorous data that can be used to analyze forced labor, and reliable empirics generally are very rare in this area. I've collected a new data set, and that involved a survey and interviews with around 1,200 workers in tea and cocoa supply chains based in India and Ghana, respectively, as well as interviews with business and government actors in several different countries. And what we found is that forced labor was not a rare occurrence. It's not something that happened in these supply chains where everyone was kind of okay, and then a few workers were unlucky, or there was a bad apple employer. Rather, we found that forced labor was emerging in the context of low wages and poor working conditions generally. So workers were moving in and out of situations that would be meeting that threshold of forced labor in relatively short periods of time, often multiple times in their lives. And I'll just tell you a bit about how this happens in the tea industry. So in tea, we included over a dozen indicators of forced labor in our study, and we found most of these to be widespread. It's worth clarifying that in the context of remote tea plantations, and given the long history of bonded labor on these plantations, many of the people we interviewed were maybe 5th or 6th generation tea workers, and their ancestors had been forcibly migrated in colonial times onto these plantations. And so given this history, employers are required to provide basic necessities to workers that include things like water, toilets, electricity, as well as housing, medical care, schools for children. And we found that although those are requirements, close to half of workers did not have access to water. Around a quarter lacked a toilet and electricity. We found that 40% of workers had unfair deductions from their wages. So for instance, employers were charging them for things like electricity that wasn't being provided to them. Over 15% of workers had their benefits withheld by management, sometimes as a punishment for complaining. For instance, if they raised, the fact that they were being charged for electricity and not receiving it. And as well, we also found that verbal abuse and harassment, and in some cases, physical abuse and gender-based violence were common. Workers in this industry are paid some minimum wages that amount to around 30% of the poverty line for India. So in this context, workers easily can find themselves in situations of forced labor. Not all of those situations amount to forced labor. But what we found is that with low wages, unlawful deductions, the under-provisioning of basic services being commonplace, all it took was, one emergency like a heart attack or needing more food to feed a growing family. And workers were forced to borrow money, often to get the things that they were supposed to be provided for free, like medical care. And they often borrowed that money from employers or from managers at usurious interest rates. And, something like that would cross them into a line of kind of quite bad working conditions into a situation of debt bondage, which is a form of forced labor. So the point here is really to say forced labor is deeply embedded in the labor conditions generally that we see in these supply chains, where low wages and various forms of abuse are pretty widespread. They're not sort of one-off anomalies that happen unexpectedly. I want to share with you just a few quotes from the workers that we interviewed, just to allow them a moment to, speak their own conditions in their own words. I'll give you a moment to read this. It's worth noting, we did not ask workers any questions that involved words like forced labor or bonded labor or slavery. We asked them short fact-based questions. And these are some of the answers that we received. So I'll quickly now share another example from a study I recently conducted on the impact of COVID-19 on patterns of forced labor in the global garment supply chain, which focused on workers in 4 countries. And I think this also helps to really flesh out a bit what forced labor looks like today and what some of the patterns are at the individual level. This study ran from September 2020 to May 2021. It was funded by the UK Arts and Humanities Research Council, and it also involved a survey and interviews with workers, in this case in 4 different countries, in Ethiopia, Honduras, India, and Myanmar, around 1,200 workers, as well as interviews with apparel brands, government representatives, social compliance industry professionals, and international organization representatives. And just was in the case, as with the T study that I mentioned, here too, we found that key indicators of forced labor were quite widespread. So you can see here on this figure, some of the most commonly reported indicators from workers in our study, including things like verbal abuse, threats and intimidation, unfair wage deductions, false promises, physical abuse, and late wages. We also included being made to work without PPE, protective equipment, or social distancing before the COVID-19 vaccine was available as an indicator. This isn't usually included in the ILO's indicators of forced labor, but we felt it was important to do so here because workers shared with us that it constituted a real threat to their lives. And indeed, it was the employment practice that made them feel the most unfree during the pandemic. So we felt that it was important to include, and a very high number of workers in our study had that experience, followed by verbal abuse, threats and intimidation, etc. We did some modeling to understand which individual level factors made workers most vulnerable to forced labor. We found that vulnerability was highest for workers who remain employed in the same factory during the pandemic, as opposed to being laid off, as millions of workers were at the beginning of the pandemic, as garment companies canceled orders and suppliers were really made to pick up the slack of the plummeting demand for clothes in the pandemic. It was also high for workers who worked large numbers of hours, for workers who accrued additional debt during the pandemic, and for workers who lost some or all of their savings. And these dynamics, which are really, kind of mundane financial dynamics in some ways, or dynamics that have to do with hours and debt, they were more important in determining who would be most vulnerable to forced labor than the other markers that we tend to hear a lot about in the literature and in policy, such as gender or migration status, which is to say that those things actually were less influential in shaping vulnerability to forced labor in the pandemic compared to these other factors. Again, here I've pulled some quotes from our interviews about the workers' conditions and how they changed during the pandemic, and I'll just give you a moment to read these. So simply put, forced labor indicators were common in both studies and were almost impossible to untangle from the day-to-day business practices that constitute kind of business as usual or the status quo of how many of these organizations operate in supply chains. So it's worth mentioning that both of these supply chains have been covered by ethical certification schemes, supplier codes of conduct, ethical certification programs, government regulation of various kinds for a very long time. And so the fact that we find such widespread indicators of forced labor is, I think, an important reminder that the systems that are in place to detect and correct and remediate forced labor are often not working very well, as I'll say more about in a moment. So as I mentioned, workers in both studies are producing goods that are bought and sold in countries like Canada or in Europe by big brand companies. And there are many millions more workers in these similar situations. So workers who are working full time for very large profitable companies or in their supply chains, and yet they're earning well below the poverty line such that they have no savings and confront coercive practices in their workplaces. And those seem to be the key ingredients for making workers highly vulnerable to situations of forced labor. And as awareness of this problem of forced labor has grown, as many of you will know, forced labor and fighting modern slavery, fighting human trafficking has become a popular cause. It's a very central issue for many governments. Policies to combat modern slavery are interestingly bipartisan. They're championed by right-wing governments and left-wing governments. Multinational corporations have warmly embraced this cause. They've hosted panels on fighting modern slavery at the World Economic Forum, United Nations summits, even rock music festivals when those were things before the pandemic, and launching elaborate corporate social responsibility programs that they claim will address these issues of modern slavery. We've also seen civil society coalitions banding together to eradicate slavery, spending millions, billions of dollars on projects that promise to end slavery in our lifetime once and for all. So how can we understand these initiatives? What's actually been done so far to try to address forced labor? I think that if we look at what public and civil society pressure have yielded so far, we see that there's a flurry of new anti-slavery governance initiatives. And these tend to fall into two categories. So first, private governance, which includes a range of strategies that companies are developing to monitor and improve working conditions in their supply chains, like ethical auditing or fair trade certification, as well as public governance. So various forms of supply chain legislation, new forms of labor law enforcement, laws that establish joint liability along supply chains. So we can think of these as both public and private, but I would note that in practice, the lines are blurring between these categories. So for instance, governments are passing home state legislation that places new responsibilities on companies incorporated within their borders to report on the steps they're taking to make sure their supply chains are slavery free. And then companies are meeting those obligations through private governance initiatives like auditing and certification. So governance is very entangled in this domain. I think we can say, I'll begin to wrap up my talk by noting that a few brief things about the effectiveness of this new wave of home state legislation to date. It's too early to say much about the effectiveness of the newer legislation, such as France's duty of vigilance law, or indeed the German supply chain due diligence act, which hasn't even come into force yet. But for legislation that has been in place longer, we find that there's considerable evidence that this isn't very effective. Transparency isn't a very effective approach to steering corporate behavior. to prevent and address forced labor in supply chains. We summarize in a recent brief by ReStructure Lab all of the academic evidence on due diligence and transparency legislation and its effectiveness, and find that basically it does very little to alter the status quo of business models and these commercial practices, which create predictable pressures towards forced labor. Some might say, well, because supply chains are so complex and they're so global, we'll never have home state legislation that works, it's doomed to fail. But I don't think that's the case. It's fully possible to design home state legislation that is effective and that does steer corporate behavior along complex supply chains. And we see this with other issue areas such as financial crime and bribery. So with my colleague, Andreas Rumkorff, a German company lawyer, we undertook a comparative study of the impact of bribery legislation and modern slavery legislation, which is essentially a very stringent form of home state legislation and a not very stringent form. And we found that the bribery legislation was very effective in steering corporate policies and practices relevant to that financial crime. Here's the brief I mentioned, which I'll just flag here. It's free and available for download on the website. And we look at all of the academic research and evidence that's out there on the effectiveness of transparency to date. And we also consider whether and to what extent due diligence legislation could overcome some of these limitations that we identify. And we note that it has significant potential to do that, but only insofar as companies and governments recognize that implementing due diligence programs can't just be about understanding and mapping forced labor risks, which has been the focus of company efforts to date, but rather it needs to be about undertaking action that address these risks, and especially the root causes of forced labor in supply chains. So the bottom line for me is that to be effective, anti-slavery governance needs to start to get at some of these commercial practices that constitute the root causes of the business demand for forced labor. So more often than not, suppliers are not using forced labor as a kind of get-rich strategy. Recruiters and intermediaries who are using forced labor are not accruing large amounts of wealth through this. Rather, often this is a means to try to stay afloat in competitive marketplaces where they're facing pricing squeezes that make them structurally very unable to cover the costs of legal minimums around labor. My colleague Andrew Crane and I have done a handful of publications where we try to map out the contemporary business models of forced labor in various industries and the many ways that it's used by producers and intermediaries to make money. And a key conclusion that I take away from this body of work and from the two studies that I just mentioned is that, forced labor has to be, the struggles against forced labor have to confront the commercial practices like wildly uneven value distribution, sourcing below the cost of production, these commercial practices that create very predictable, very pinpointable pressure to drive labor costs below legal minimums. So for me, the litmus test for any new governance initiative is, will it actually transform the business model? Will it help companies to put in place the innovation needed to ensure decent work? And I'll just end this talk briefly with a tiny bit of good news, which is that I think there are some emerging efforts to tackle the supply chain dynamics that give rise to forced labor. There are many I could mention here, from worker-driven social responsibility programs to new models of labor market enforcement that try to follow the money in complex supply chains. But I'll just pick one which I've had the honor to be involved in, which is the UK Parliament's Modern Slavery Statement published in July 2021. As the foreword to the statement notes, the Parliament's Modern Slavery Program was initiated last year in 2020, and it focuses on a range of areas, including procurement and due diligence activity. And the statement you can find online, it reports on the Parliament's own supply chain. So its contracts, its suppliers, its spending. And as it details, in the first year of the program, Parliament has invited 94 suppliers that they consider high risk to complete an assessment tool. And those businesses will then receive recommendations whose implementation will be monitored. And so they are getting at commercial dynamics here. Responsible purchasing practices, the purchasing power of parliament, living wages, these are all key themes in this statement. And so while this program is in its early days, I think it's really notable that Parliament is setting this example by developing, as they call it, a robust and meaningful due diligence program rather than creating box ticking exercises. So I'll leave it there so that we have time for questions and discussion. And thank you very much again for your attention.
Thank you so much, Genevieve, for such an interesting talk. I have plenty of questions, and I'm sure the audience as well. So why don't we open the floor directly for questions or remarks or comments? So I'm just going to read out the question. If you don't want to spell it out, thank you for your talk. How would you assess current models of modern slavery legislations in countries such as Australia and the UK? Do they bring added value to rights holder in global South? Do they have potential to bring about positive change in companies and their global supply chains? Asks Hertie, if I'm not mistaken.
Great. Well, thank you, Hertie. That's a great question. I think it really depends on how companies take it up. So what we see is that these pieces of legislation, they leave a lot of discretion to companies in terms of how they wish to act according to the legislation. So if we take the UK law, what it requires companies to do is to report on any measures, voluntary measures that they happen to be taking to prevent or address forced labor in their supply chain. And they could respond by saying we're doing nothing, or by not responding at all, not publishing a statement, even though they're required to, which it's estimated that about half of companies covered under this legislation did, and received really no penalty for non-compliance. And so, I suppose it's possible that that this legislation is helpful to rights holders in the global South, but my worry is that the ways in which companies have acted is to treat this legislation as a sort of box ticking exercise, to say we're auditing, we're certifying, so our hands are clean. And yet we know from studies, including my own, that look at what's really happening on the ground in certified, audited supply chains, that that this isn't an effective way to detect forced labor, to address forced labor, to remediate situations where it has occurred. And so I think it's really, to me, unlikely to bring too much positive change on the ground, unless the legislation is strengthened to require more specific and consistent changes. But of course, there is some excitement that it has caused the issue of modern slavery to be elevated within organizations, and has kind of bolstered the power of people working within business to try to raise the importance of this issue within their company. And so, there's some optimism there, I suppose.
Thank you. Anyone else? Feel free to raise your hands as well, virtual hand. In the meantime, I'm going to ask a question of mine then, and it's about the link between how organized the workers are and instances of forced labor. So you mentioned in your tea and cocoa study that the workers talked about management and so on. So I assume that there's some kind of organization employing the workers, but that's not the case in every supply chains, right? So there's some cocoa actually in Côte d'Ivoire where there's just farmers essentially. So I wanted to have your opinion on how organization affects the occurrence of forced labor, essentially?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. It's one that is a bit tricky to answer in the sense that there's very little evidence on those links, and the evidence that is there is quite blurry. So for instance, we found in our garment study, we looked at unionization, whether a worker was a member of a union as part of the individual level data that we collected. And what we found actually was that being part of a union made workers more vulnerable to forced labor in the pandemic. And that's for a quite specific reason, which is that one of the compromises that unions made during the pandemic was to say, basically, any kind of work is better than losing jobs. So the mass layoffs that were happening at the beginning of the pandemic, some unions were able to avoid that and to keep workers employed by relaxing certain expectations around, for instance, hours and forced overtime and some of these other things. And so in the end, the economic situation of those workers was better, because we found that workers who were laid off tended to spiral downwards and take work that was even less remunerative and more dangerous and more difficult during the pandemic. But it means that there's not a sort of easy link that we'd imagine there might be between, if you're unionized, you're less vulnerable to forced labor. In general, I think it really depends what kind of union it is as well. So with the tea workers, we heard a lot from workers that they had raised a lot of complaints to the union about things like housing, and that the union was very much allied with management to not address some of the issues. I think Mark Anner has done some great work on looking at the different types of unions that workers are part of and which ones are more or less willing to confront management and business over these sorts of issues. So I would certainly recommend his work as well. But from what we've found, there's not this kind of nice, clear link that we'd like to see between unionization rendering you less vulnerable to forced labor.
Wonderful, thanks a lot. So I'm going to read out a question by Alicia in the chat. How do you think new business models should deal with issues of corporate lobbying? Does lobbying as a practice need to be eradicated to get businesses on board? Or how do you think lobbying can be effectively regulated to support the rights of workers in supply chains?
Hi, Alicia. Nice to see / read your question. Very good question. Curious what you think, of course. I think this is a really tricky one. Lobbying obviously needs to be effectively regulated. I think that's clear, because what we see is that on the one hand, companies are forming these elaborate corporate social responsibility initiatives. They're really taking this issue of forced labor and modern slavery and making big public declarations and commitments around it. And then on the other hand, they're indeed seeking to influence national political economic contexts and global efforts at regulation in ways that reinforce the key drivers of forced labor in supply chains. And so they're often speaking out of two sides of their mouths on this issue. And that's something that certainly needs to be addressed if we're getting serious about dealing with these problems in supply chains.
Thank you. And now a question from Daniel, who thanks you for your presentation. The topic of value distribution and having sound commercial practices at the root of production hit the nail in the head. Do you believe this can only be done through legislation, or is it possible that the private sphere can develop itself in this front? I understand you touched upon this point in the previous to last question. The supply chains are very commonly hidden.
Yes, thank you, Daniel. That's a really good question as well. I think it is certainly feasible for the private sphere to develop itself on this front. Indeed, I spent over a year in the aftermath of this tea study working with a tea company who approached me and said, a lot of what we've read resonates with us. We see these issues in our supply chain, and we would like to embark on an experiment with you to see if we can, redesign our business model and our supply chain dynamics to prevent these issues from happening in our supply chain. And I have to say, I was very surprised by that. It's not the sort of thing that I expect from companies, but we embarked on some joint research where we had access to a lot of their records and their workforce, and did an analysis of what it would take to eradicate forced labor and essentially build a model that would prevent it in the future in the supply chain. Many good lessons come from that. I think one, though, that I would say this is where I feel a bit pessimistic about companies addressing this on their own, is that there is a problem whereby if only one of the big buyers is willing to, for instance, pay more to get tea that isn't made with forced labor, and they're willing to kind of redistribute value, if they are not, if they're doing that alone and the rest of the companies that are sourcing from that supplier are not willing to do so, then you have a real problem, because the supplier, maybe can't change all of its practices if somebody who maybe amounts to like 8% or 10% of their business is the only one who wants them to do so. And so I think that's where we see that actually, leveling the playing field through government regulation is a really important step here to give them a nudge on this trajectory, because otherwise there is a pressure that is a real pressure that comes often from shareholders and legal requirements around shareholder value, to funnel up as much as possible of the value in the supply chain to the top of the supply chain. So I think it is certainly feasible that business can take the initiative, that things can move forward to a certain point on that front. But I do think there are some real barriers there to coordinating action between many companies, and it seems that the very large ones are especially constrained by shareholder value requirements, and can't really voluntarily make the decision to pay workers more or pay more for goods than they need to, because it will take away money at the top.
Yeah, thank you. Question by Erwin, great presentation. My question is related to local governments. How do you see the role of municipalities in making possible to prevent modern slavery, especially in supply chains? I'm just quickly going to hijack that question as well, because when we speak about modern slavery in the North, I always think about these nail bars in London, for instance, where a lot of Southeast Asians are not employed, but essentially exploited, sorry. And so my question is, can you give an answer as well in terms of both more or less effective local governments and less effective ones with respect to that question?
Sure. Great question. So I think here it really comes down to labor law enforcement. It's not a very glamorous issue, but this is really what it comes down to in terms of local governments. Are local governments willing to have a situation where businesses that are perpetually reliant on forced labor or trafficking or something quite close to that, are they happy for that to be commonplace in their municipality? And if not, the way to make that unviable and unprofitable is to enforce labor law. So we see across many different contexts, global North, global South, just the decline of budgets for labor law inspection, the kind of under-resourcing of enforcement. And I think in some municipalities, you have like it's just such a fractional chance that you would ever be inspected in any way, that this is part of what allows these practices to thrive. We see where municipalities have decided to crack down and start enforcing labor law, by doing things like random inspections, by doing state-based very deep audits. Often in the US, we're seeing a trend right now where there are worker centers. Janice Fine has written about this, and it's a kind of innovative model of enforcement where there's collaboration between worker organizations and municipal governments. And they're doing, workers and worker organizations know best where exploitation is happening. And if they're working with government to do inspections and prosecutions and to really make this ensure that businesses are held responsible for these practices when they do occur, then we find that there's far less of this sort of thing happening in those places. So I think that this is really the kind of the basic but important point here, is looking at whether there's inspections, whether there's enforcement of regulations that do exist on the books, what powers still remain with state-based inspectors, which powers have sort of been just taken up by private auditors who don't do the same thing. And that's where we will see whether the role of municipalities is positive or negative, really, when it comes to the issue of forced labor.
Thanks a lot. I don't see any other question, but feel free to type in the chat or to take the stage by raising your hand. Michael, do you have a question?
Okay. Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much for this interesting talk, and also for the book, which I just read, which I found very inspiring. But I have one question, or two questions. I've been collaborating with the Clean Clothes campaign for some time, not being an active part of it, but collaborating with that. And I think their work is a little bit contradicts your judgments, or they have been participating in two initiatives. One is the Bangladesh Accord, which for sure. And the other one is the Fair Wear Foundation, where many outdoor apparel manufacturers are also engaged in. And this Fair Wear Foundation, for example, they have a public complaints mechanism, which is also overseen by the steering committee of this organization. And this also includes the Clean Clothes campaign as an NGO. I would say as a quite critical NGO. Would that be a model of these two things, the Accord and Fair Wear Foundation? And the second question is about the German supply chain due diligence law, which I think is somewhat different from the previous laws, like the UK modern slavery law or the California law, Austrian law, etc., because it really forces companies to install several mechanisms, and especially they have to install a complaints mechanism. And this must be open not only to direct workers, but also to pretty open to also third parties, which can raise a complaint. And then companies have to react. If they do not react, they can be fined. So, and this is something which, to my knowledge, these other initiatives so far, such a mechanism is not there. And probably the European Commission will pass a directive pretty soon, which will also be probably quite similar to the German law. We don't know yet, but probably. And so there might be European regulation quite similar to this German fair supply chain due diligence law. And I just wonder what you think of this.
Thank you, Michael.
Yes, thank you, Michael, and thank you for your kind words about my book and my work. That's really lovely to hear. I think that's a really important question on both fronts. So with the due diligence legislation, yeah, we will see. I certainly agree from what I know of the German law that there are some important distinctions to be made from the basic transparency legislation that we saw in California and in the UK. It remains to be seen to what extent this will be fully intact. In France, when the law was first published, there were also very high penalties, and there was a lot of stringency there, and it got chipped away a bit in practice by courts and others. And so I think, it is very exciting, but we also need to see in practice what this yields. And that's the sort of studies that I've been doing, is looking at on the ground effectiveness. And there, I think, it's just so early that we couldn't say. But I remain hopeful that if due diligence is done in a stringent way, where there are strong penalties, where there's robust enforcement, where companies cannot just sort of tick a bunch of boxes and then be done with it, then this is a very powerful lever and tool. And we outline in this brief I mentioned what we think the key features of due diligence legislation are that are required to make it effective based on the research that's out there so far, our own studies and others. So I share your, what I'm sensing is an optimism that these are game changers, but I also think, as somebody who has studied for a long time the kind of on the ground effectiveness, I would like to see the data and see what happens. On the CCC, yes, absolutely. So the Bangladesh Accord, especially the original iteration of it, which, as you'll know, recently expired, and then there's this whole process around renewal and that sort of thing. This was a very stringent piece of supply chain governance. I think, some of the things that I was saying are important. It's a very powerful example of. So it is a worker-driven initiative. It does have a bit of a value redistribution component. It does involve workers and state-based inspectors very closely in the monitoring piece of the accord. And there are real commercial consequences for not upholding responsibilities under the accord. So I agree with you that this is important, but again, I think what we're seeing is that over time, as the Rana Plaza incident fades from the spotlight and from people's minds, we've seen that chipped away at in various ways. And so the longevity of something like that, I think, is worrying, and we need to keep an eye on where this will go next. Very much in support of the Fairware Foundation's emphasis on purchasing practices, on external complaint mechanisms. Again, I think this is an initiative that has a lot to be excited about. And indeed, we worked with the Worker Rights Consortium on this garment study that I mentioned, and I've worked with CCC in the past as well. So yes, I'm aware of these initiatives and feel they're very promising in different respects.
Wonderful. Thanks a lot, Genevieve, and thanks everyone. We've managed to go slightly over time, so unfortunately we'll have to close here. I just want to thank you, Genevieve, so much for your talk, which was really fascinating to me, and I think to the audience as well. And I just want to highlight that this is part of a series of events that is about commemorating the past by highlighting how past issues translates into today's world. And I think you've done that beautifully, even though the kind of the takeaway is somewhat bleak. But again, as I emphasized in the beginning, I think you point to very actionable solutions as well. So thank you for doing that here at Hertie. And thank you everyone for participating.
Thank you for having me and for hosting it so beautifully.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.